Inside Pelican Bay, California's most feared prison. In one remote corner of Northern California sits a prison designed for the inmates the state considers the most dangerous. Inside, some prisoners have spent decades alone in concrete cells, locked away for 22 to 24 hours a day. No windows. No physical contact. Almost no human interaction. This is Pelican Bay State Prison, a facility that has become one of the most controversial prisons in American history. Supporters say it was built to control violent prison gangs. Critics say it became a symbol of extreme isolation and psychological punishment. But to understand why Pelican Bay exists, we first have to understand the crisis inside California's prisons that led to its creation. Before we go further, if you value fact-based prison documentaries like this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing accurate stories from inside prisons around the world. Now, let's step inside one of the most feared correctional facilities ever built. California's prison crisis. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, California's prison system was under intense pressure. The inmate population was growing rapidly. At the same time, organized prison gangs were gaining influence inside correctional facilities across the state. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia had developed complex structures that extended both inside and outside prison walls. Authorities reported that these gangs were responsible for ordering assaults, extortion, and murders from within the prison system. Investigators later described the situation as a network of influence that could reach into multiple institutions at once. Traditional prisons were not designed to contain that level of organized activity. Prison officials increasingly believed they needed a new kind of facility, one specifically designed to isolate gang leadership and inmates considered extremely violent. The birth of the Supermax concept. Before Pelican Bay existed, another prison had already changed how the United States dealt with dangerous inmates. In 1983, violence at the federal prison United States Penitentiary, Marion reached a breaking point. 2 correctional officers were killed in separate incidents. After those events, the facility entered what officials called permanent lockdown. Most inmates were confined to their cells nearly all day. Limited contact between prisoners became the new standard. This model would later influence the design of a new generation of prisons known as Supermax facilities. Supermax prisons were designed with one central goal: complete control through isolation. Instead of housing hundreds of inmates together in shared yards and cell blocks, Supermax prisons focused on small, secure units where prisoners rarely interacted with each other. For California officials dealing with gang violence, this approach appeared to offer a solution. Choosing the location. California authorities began planning a new high-security prison in the mid-1980s. The state selected a remote area near the town of Crescent City, located in Del Norte County near the Oregon border. The location was intentionally isolated. Crescent City sits more than 300 miles north of San Francisco. The surrounding region is dominated by forests, rugged coastline, and long stretches of highway with few major population centers. Supporters of the plan believed the remote setting would help prevent outside communication and make the prison easier to secure. Construction began in the late 1980s. The facility would become known as Pelican Bay State Prison, named after the nearby bay along the Pacific coast. When it opened in 1989, it represented one of the most technologically advanced and restrictive prisons ever built in the United States. A prison designed for isolation. Pelican Bay was built differently from almost every other prison in California. The facility includes 2 main sections. The general population housing units, where many inmates live in traditional prison settings. And the security housing unit, commonly called the SHU. The SHU became the feature that would define Pelican Bay's reputation. Inside the SHU, inmates are typically held in individual concrete cells measuring approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. Each cell contains a bed, a toilet, and a small desk. Unlike many traditional prison cells, SHU cells do not have windows facing outside. Instead, light usually enters through a narrow skylight or small opening in the ceiling area. Doors are made of solid steel with small food slots. Communication between inmates is extremely limited. Many prisoners in the SHU spend 22 to 23 hours per day inside their cells. Exercise, when permitted, often takes place alone in small concrete yards sometimes referred to as dog runs. The purpose of the SHU. When Pelican Bay opened, prison officials described the SHU as a tool to control inmates who were considered the most disruptive or dangerous. These included prisoners accused of leading prison gangs, organizing violence inside prisons, committing serious assaults while incarcerated. Officials argued that separating these individuals from the general population would reduce violence throughout the system. But critics quickly began questioning the policy. Many inmates were placed in the SHU not for specific acts of violence, but because authorities believed they were affiliated with prison gangs. Determining gang affiliation often relied on intelligence gathered by prison investigators. That intelligence could include confidential informants, letters or drawings interpreted as gang symbols, association with known gang members. Some prisoners remained in the SHU for years or even decades. In many cases, release from the unit required an inmate to renounce gang affiliation or provide information about gang activities. Supporters said the system was necessary to maintain safety. Critics argued it created indefinite isolation without clear pathways back to the general population. Early controversy. Within a few years of opening, Pelican Bay began attracting national attention. Reports from attorneys, journalists, and advocacy groups described conditions that many considered among the harshest in the United States prison system. Former inmates described the experience of living in near-total isolation. Some said the lack of human contact caused severe psychological stress. Correctional officials, however, maintained that the measures were necessary. They pointed to ongoing violence linked to prison gangs across California. From their perspective, the SHU was designed to prevent gang leaders from issuing orders that could lead to assaults or killings inside prisons. This debate would continue for decades, and eventually lead to major lawsuits, investigations, and reforms. But before that happened, Pelican Bay would experience a series of incidents that brought the prison into national headlines. And one of the most significant events would occur just 5 years after the prison opened. Violence, lawsuits, and the shadow of the SHU. Life inside the security housing unit. Inside this section of the prison, hundreds of inmates lived under conditions that were very different from those in traditional cell blocks. Prisoners in the SHU were typically housed alone in small concrete cells. Meals were passed through metal slots in the doors. Conversations between prisoners were limited, often occurring only through small gaps or by shouting down the tier. Exercise usually meant being escorted, alone, to a bare concrete yard surrounded by high walls and metal fencing. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, these measures were designed to control inmates considered the most dangerous or disruptive within the prison system. Many of the prisoners held there were alleged members of powerful prison gangs. Officials believed isolating those individuals could prevent them from coordinating violence across multiple institutions. But critics argued that the system relied too heavily on long-term isolation. Some inmates remained in the SHU for years at a time, sometimes without a clear end date. Over time, Pelican Bay became one of the most prominent examples in the United States of extended solitary confinement. The Gang Investigation Units. To manage gang activity, California created specialized investigative teams inside its prisons. These units were often called Institutional Gang Investigators, or IGIs. Their job was to track the activities of prison gangs and determine which inmates were affiliated with them. Investigators reviewed letters, artwork, coded messages, and testimony from informants. Sometimes gang affiliation was determined through multiple pieces of intelligence gathered over time. But the process was controversial. Civil rights attorneys argued that the evidence used to label inmates as gang members could sometimes be ambiguous or indirect. For example, certain drawings or symbols might be interpreted as gang-related. Possessing those items could contribute to an inmate being classified as a gang affiliate. Once labeled as such, a prisoner could be transferred to the SHU. According to official policy at the time, inmates often had two main paths out of the unit: completing a long review process, or agreeing to provide information about gang activity. Supporters of the policy said it helped weaken prison gang networks. Critics argued it placed prisoners in indefinite isolation based on intelligence assessments rather than specific acts of violence. The 1992 lawsuit. In 1992, Pelican Bay became the focus of one of the most significant prison lawsuits in California history. A group of inmates filed a federal civil rights case challenging conditions inside the SHU. The case would eventually become known as Madrid versus Gomez. The lawsuit alleged that conditions in the SHU violated the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The plaintiffs argued that long-term isolation and certain use of force incidents by staff had caused serious harm to prisoners. Federal courts began examining evidence about daily life inside Pelican Bay. Testimony came from inmates, prison officials, mental health experts, and correctional officers. The case would take several years to move through the legal system. And when the ruling finally came, it would become one of the most widely cited decisions about Supermax prisons in the United States. Allegations of guard brutality. During the Madrid lawsuit, attorneys presented testimony describing alleged incidents involving excessive force by correctional officers. One particular area of concern involved cell extractions. A cell extraction occurs when officers remove an inmate from a cell, usually after the prisoner refuses orders or poses a safety threat. These operations often involve multiple officers wearing protective equipment. In the Pelican Bay case, some inmates claimed they had been subjected to unnecessary force during these extractions. Prison officials disputed many of the allegations, stating that force was used only when necessary to maintain safety and order. But the court reviewed numerous reports and testimonies while evaluating the claims. Some of the evidence presented included medical records, incident reports, and witness accounts. The issue of force inside Pelican Bay would become a central topic in the final court ruling. Mental health concerns. Another major focus of the lawsuit involved the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Mental health experts testified about how extended solitary confinement could affect prisoners. Some studies suggested that prisoners held in near-total isolation for long periods could experience symptoms such as anxiety, hallucinations, depression, difficulty concentrating. The court examined whether Pelican Bay's SHU conditions were appropriate for inmates with serious mental illnesses. Evidence presented during the trial indicated that certain prisoners with documented psychiatric conditions had been placed in the unit. Experts argued that those conditions could worsen in extreme isolation. This issue would later become one of the most significant findings in the court's decision. The 1995 federal ruling. In 1995, U.S. District Judge Thelton Henderson issued the final decision in the case of Madrid versus Gomez. The ruling was complex. The court did not declare Pelican Bay's SHU itself unconstitutional. However, the judge found that certain practices at the prison did violate the Constitution. One of the most significant findings involved the placement of mentally ill prisoners in extreme isolation. The court ruled that holding inmates with serious mental illness in the SHU could amount to cruel and unusual punishment. As a result, the state was ordered to change policies regarding mental health screening and treatment. The court also criticized certain use of force incidents and required reforms in how force was documented and supervised. Despite those changes, Pelican Bay's SHU continued to operate. And the debate over long-term solitary confinement in California prisons did not end. In fact, over the next decade, the issue would grow even larger. The prison gang wars continue. Even as legal battles continued, prison officials still faced the challenge that had led to Pelican Bay's creation in the first place. Organized prison gangs. Groups such as the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Aryan Brotherhood maintained reputations for directing criminal activity both inside and outside prison walls. Investigations by law enforcement agencies suggested that some gang leaders used coded messages and intermediaries to communicate with members across the prison system. Authorities argued that the SHU remained one of the few tools capable of disrupting that communication. But critics continued to question whether indefinite isolation was the only solution. By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay had become a symbol of a larger national debate about how prisons should handle violent offenders and gang leadership. That debate would soon reach a breaking point. And it would be driven by the inmates themselves. If this story taught us anything, it's that prisons like Pelican Bay raise difficult questions about safety, justice, and the limits of punishment. For decades, this remote facility on California's northern coast has been used to control some of the most dangerous inmates in the state. Supporters say it helped reduce prison violence. Critics argue it created a system of extreme isolation that lasted far too long. The debate over Pelican Bay, and solitary confinement in general, continues today. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing real, factual stories from inside prisons around the world. And if there's a prison, criminal case, or historical event you want us to investigate next, leave it in the comments. Until the next story, stay curious, stay informed, and thank you for watching.